2000 Chevy S10 pickup with a 2.2 liter engine. We are dealing with a no start situation. This is one of our students' vehicles. He informed me that after replacing a downstream O2 sensor on his way home, the vehicle died and would not restart. So it was brought into us like this. The air intake is off. I believe that they were spraying starting fluid in this. It smells like starting fluid. And we're gonna start with finding out what we're missing. Is it spark? Is it fuel? Okay, unfortunately, when we were checking for spark, pull a plug wire off. This is typical though. We run into this all the time. The end of the plug wire broke. No big deal, we can fix that, but we can continue with our check. I have a test light connected to ground. Go ahead and crank it. All right, good. You see we got good spark from that, so we're going after fuel next. Okay, what we wanted to do was check fuel pressure, and unfortunately on this 2.2 they don't give us a Schrader valve. What we would have to do is remove this fuel line right here and tee in a gauge. We're not going to do that. We're going to try to do some other quick tests. What we're going to do is spray some carb clean into the intake and see if it runs off of that. Quick note on some safety here. We had a plug wire that was open and arcing. We fixed that, installed that back in its place. We want to make sure that we're careful with eye protection and things like that. We could have an intake backfire during this process, have a fireball in our hand. So this isn't the safest method in the world of attempting to identify a fuel problem or not. Is that starting fluid or carb clean? I like carburetor cleaner better. It's not as volatile as starting fluid. So we're just gonna put a shot of carb clean and see if it attempts to start off of this. If it does, that means we're gonna go after a fuel problem next, because we have spark. If it does not, then we're gonna go in a different direction altogether. We're not gonna worry about teeing in a fuel pressure gauge and things like that. So go ahead and throw a little bit in there. Hold the throttle open inside the car a little bit. And when you're ready, you go ahead and crank it. Okay, good. So you saw no attempt whatsoever for this engine to start, and what that means is we're not going to go after fuel. I'm not going to worry about teeing in a fuel pressure gauge to this vehicle. We just saved ourselves a bunch of time. I don't like the way this thing sounds. It sounds funny the way it's cranking, but we have spark, we have fuel, we have to go in another direction. All right, we have some scan data pulled up. I have RPM, TPS, and my map voltage pulled up. I also have map inches of mercury over here. That's just our converted value of our map voltage. And what we're gonna do right now is a cranking test. Remember, the car doesn't start. We liked our spark. We're saying we had good fuel based on the fact that it won't start with carburetor cleaner. Pretty good assumption we're getting fuel in this vehicle. We didn't like the way it sounded cranking. We're primarily for this test looking at our map voltage during a crank, and hopefully that'll show us something. Go ahead and crank it. Okay, good. And that was with the throttle closed, and hold the throttle wide open. Go ahead and crank it. Okay, good. And that second test was with the throttle at wide open. Let me pause this picture and we'll talk about it. All right, so we're clear with what we're looking at. Where I placed the blue cursors was our first crank. We had the throttle closed at this point in time. You see our RPM over here. We have RPM activity, and we have map inches of mercury and map voltage that is changing during the crank. Now I want to talk about the map voltage. And with the key on engine off, we had, let me get that number here, 4.65 volts during the period of time where we were not cranking, which would have been actually over in here. 4.65 volts would be atmospheric pressure. Key on engine off, map voltage, that's what you have in a manifold, is atmospheric pressure. We crank the engine over, and what you need to know about map voltage is with vacuum increases, voltage will decrease. Another way you could state it would be with a pressure decrease, voltage will decrease. Also, with pressure increases, voltage will increase. So we have an issue here And the issue that we're seeing on this map sensor is we're having pressure increases during cranking. This is a naturally aspirated engine. That should not be occurring. And what we showed in the second test with our RPM, let me move my cursors over. RPM, you see our RPM activity, and you see our map and map inches of mercury were steady during the second test, and the difference was we had the throttle wide open. So throttle wide open, we're not seeing those same kind of pressure changes in the manifold. This is giving us some direction. Let's look at the trouble codes next and see where we're gonna go with this. Okay, here's a shot of our code list. We have a map code, an O2 code, cam sensor, evap. We actually have a PCM EEPROM memory performance code. Don't like that one at all. And we have a generator L control circuit issue. So multiple codes. Now, this is pretty typical. We get these cars in the field. This is a student's car, and he was doing some repairs. He did just change his downstream O2, and he was playing around with this thing trying to get it started. There's a very real possibility that some of these codes were set by unplugging components. We don't know that for sure. What I don't like for sure is this PCM EEPROM error, but based on our map voltage pressure increases, or our map increases during a crank, I'm saying we have a mechanical problem. We may have to come back to this one. I think I want to focus on the mechanical issue with this engine first, and we are concerned about this cam position sensor circuit problem tied in with this. So let's talk about what we saw in our waveform again, and then we may have to come back and address this in other videos for multiple issues. I'm not sure where this is going to take us yet. I believe we have a mechanical issue. We need to talk about that a little bit more. Okay, back to our cranking scan data capture. These are a little bit different order because it's a stored picture. My map's on the top, my RPM bottom left, TPS bottom right. Again, wide open throttle, we don't see those pressure increases. So focusing on the pressure increases, there's really one main thing I was thinking of, and then I talked to our engine teacher, Mr. Kaplan, who's awesome, and gave me some direction on this waveform. Well, I was thinking of a plugged exhaust, giving me pressure increases in the manifold. Completely plugged exhaust, that would be. It wouldn't be, one that's causing this vehicle to not start at all. And that may be a little bit of insight. We can use a map sensor during cranking. We see a voltage rise on a map sensor during engine cranking. That's a good chance you got a completely plugged exhaust. There's another one that could be our issue here, and that is a chain issue, a timing chain issue. And we do have a cam sensor trouble code, so that may fit this scenario that our valve timing is off and we're getting pressure increases in the manifold from a valve timing problem. Definitely a mechanical issue here. I think the next step that we're going to do is some timing checks using the scope, verifying top dead center compression and synchronizing that with an ignition timing event. We've done this in other videos. There's a lot of different directions we can go with it. If this was an engine that had an oil cap that we could actually see the rocker arms, we could pull the oil cap off and see if the rocker arms are moving. There's some basic checks you can do. So there isn't one right way to do this. I think just because it's easy to do and we have the equipment to do it, we'll pull one spark plug out, we'll put our pressure transducer in the cylinder, we'll synchronize it with an ignition firing event, and see if our spark timing is anywhere near top dead center. It's a very easy test to do. I think that's the next one we're going. In the last segment, I said I was going to do an in-cylinder pressure transducer test, compare it to an ignition firing event. I've done this in a few of my other videos. I've decided to change direction simply because it's just easier to do a relative compression test, which is measuring starter current, comparing it to a firing event. And I just don't feel like taking the spark plugs out is really where I'm at with this. The setup I'm using is I'm using an amp probe on the battery cable, and current flow can be measured on either side of the circuit. So I have, kind of tough to see in this picture here, but my negative cable comes down right behind the intake here, and that's where my amp clamp is connected. I'm on the battery negative, so I'll measure starter current there. And then I have a RPM pickup, just a little sync probe RPM pickup connected to my number one spark plug wire. And you see that right there. And so what I'm going to do is every time I get a number one cylinder spark plug fire, I'm going to see that impulse on that one, and I'll compare that to my starter current. And we chose this method rather than the in cylinder simply because I wanted to see all four of them first too. It's easier, and I wanted to see all four. So I'll get you a shot of the screen next. Okay, again, I'm using the Pico scope for this. I'll show you guys the setups real quick. Channel A is going to be my amp probe, and I'm using a high amp current clamp, this 600 amp. And I'm going to set that to my negative 100 to 500 amp scale. It actually doesn't matter because I have a real nice zoom feature with this scope. Channel B is my RPM pickup, and I'm not sure what the voltage is going to be on this, the output, so we'll start with a 20 volt. And we're just going to see impulses on that. Then as far as screen time goes, when I do relative compression testing, I generally like a 2-second screen. So a 2-second screen on this is going to be 200 milliseconds per division. So each division is 200 milliseconds long. You see down here we're at 2 seconds total screen time. I don't have a trigger set for this right now, and I don't think I want to do trigger settings for this video. Maybe another video I'll do some trigger settings, but go ahead and crank that for me. You want to hold it to the floor, clear flood crank. I mean, we know the car's not going to start. We have spark, we have fuel, but let's see what this looks like. Okay, good. Now, the downside of this RPM pickup that I was just using is it was backfeeding into my other channel, and I might want to throw a filter in here. Let's see if I can filter that out of my amperage waveform. The voltage waveform that you're looking at, this is a waste spark. So we have a high, low, high, low, high, low event taking place. The high portion is the number one cylinder top dead center compression. The low portion is the number one cylinder top dead center exhaust. And between these two cursors, I'll put two cursors in here. We'll go with this high one right here and this one right here. This would be 720 degrees of crankshaft rotation. So we have in 720 degrees of crank rotation, again, we know that because this is number one cylinder top dead center compression with the high spike. Number one cylinder top dead center exhaust, its companion would be number 4. And we're back to number 1 again. We should have 4 humps in between these cursors. And you can see that we really only have maybe 2. There's one decent one, and that's the number 1 cylinder. Just so happens to be the number 1 cylinder. And that's it. So clearly we have a compression problem on this engine, so that's pretty cool that we were able to identify that without pulling all of the plugs out one by one and putting the transducer in each cylinder. We have a mechanical problem. We've identified that. We said that by looking at the map sensor that we had a mechanical problem. The interesting part though is our timing for our number 1 looks like it's in time with the peak of this compression waveform. So remember this variable for this video, and I've shown this in other videos, and there are some of you guys that ask some great questions. Well, what about, can you have an engine with the chain off and still have ignition timing line up? And guys, guess what? The answer is yes, you can. There are variables here. And what I want to do next, based on the outcome of this, clearly, again, we have a mechanical problem. What I want to do next is I want to show the cam and crank signals on this engine. And it's another way that we can identify a jumped chain is to verify camshaft and crankshaft relationship to each other. And I want to do that next. Now, the only downside is I don't believe I have a known good waveform for this 2.2 Chevy engine. Nice thing about my friends over at IATN, International Automotive Technician Network, I could probably get a known good waveform from one of those guys over there. So again, you guys that are not familiar with IATN, you need to look at those guys. That's where I get a lot of my information and resources from. So next step is cam crank relationships. That's where we're going. Just a quick shot of the scope I'm using. It's a Pico 4000, And my final two channels that we're gonna hook up is cam and crank. So we'll go crank with the blue trace, cam with the red. I'll leave my relative compression ignition timing one up there too. And nice thing about Pico is they got these insulated T-pins. I know some of you guys have been concerned about the T-pins, and rightly so, that if these T-pins touch each other, you can have damage to electronic circuitry. So nice that they insulated those. And there's something else I guess I'll take a second and address, and that is my wedding ring on my hand that you see. I never take it off. And I have to tell you guys that any jewelry on a vehicle, you touch that gold band to something that's hot and a ground, it's going to glow white hot before you have time to pull your hand away. And you know, I have it in there mainly because I haven't taken it off in the past 15 years. I'm not going to take it off, but I do. When I reach my hand in a location around a starter, around an alternator where I can't see that BAT post, I'm taking my ring off. So I'm aware of the dangers of this, guys, and I don't want you guys to think that this is acceptable. It really isn't. I shouldn't have it on, but I'm just not taking it off. My choice. I'll take a chance. Just wanted to address that. Okay, so going to the car, cam and crank, channels C and D, we're gonna have cam and crank, and A and B will keep the starter current and sync probe up there and see what this looks like. We already know we have a mechanical problem. Just want to identify this a little bit further, see what's going on. Quick shot of the location of these sensors. Cam sensor is the red trace, bottom wire of the cam. I believe it was brown and black. I can't remember the wire tracer. And then the crank is down here. It's a 7X crank signal, and I'm on the yellow wire. So we should have an AC sine wave on my blue channel, should have a digital square wave on my red channel. Back to the scope. This was my last screen. I'm gonna turn on my other channels. Again, my third channel, which I have is blue, a blue colored lead. This is gonna be an AC sine wave. So, I don't know, cranking condition, I'll set that to a 5 volt plus minus. You're not gonna have a real high amplitude on that at cranking speeds. And then the final channel is gonna be a digital square wave, and GMs, knowing GMs use 12 volt pull-up design on their cam sensor, so I'm going to set this to a 20. A lot of questions I get is how do you know what channels to use, what voltage readings, what scales, and truthfully a lot of that comes with experience. And the other thing too is, as a rule, if you don't like what you see when you have the signal on the screen, is you can change the scales afterward. So it's really acquire the signal, see what it looks like, adjust your scales. It's really that simple. All right, go ahead and crank that for me. Okay, hang on. I do not have a crank signal here or cam, so I need to check my leads. Okay, I got everything set up. We should have a waveform now. Go ahead and crank that. All right, that works. All right, what we're looking at here, we have a crank signal, missing a cam signal. We need to look into this a little bit further, but again, we have compression losses here, and I believe I misspoke in my last segment, and I know this now because I'm looking at my crank signal, and from here, this is a 7X crank, to here would be 360 of the crankshaft. We should have 2 cylinders firing in there. And then from there to there is 720 of the crank. We should have 4 cylinders firing in there. In my last segment, based on my high-low spark lines, I was saying that we only had 1 cylinder basically. What I'm seeing here is we have 2 cylinders that are contributing and 2 that are not. And I believe what happened is my high-low event here, I have this set up wrong, so I'm gonna have to reset my sync probe to see this a little bit clearer. All right, we should be good now. I readjusted my kV scale for this sync pickup, and it was actually picking up a plug wire next to it, so I moved it away from it. This is gonna change the results of this test. Go ahead and crank it. Okay, good. All right, before I talk about this red trace and what we're seeing now, notice the cam pulse is missing, that we're pretty much a steady flat line on that. We are seeing some up downs in that signal, but those are related to starter current. You see how they match the current or compression waveforms, that we're getting these amperage changes in the system, and that's changing that voltage. There's no cam signal here at all, and that matches our trouble code. All right, in the original segment when I told you we only had one cylinder with compression, I was incorrect. My sync probe was set up wrong. From this point to this point right here is 720 degrees of crank. You can see that based on the crank signal. It's a 7x crank. So we have 7 pulses of the crank for every 360 of the crank. So there's 7 pulses here, there's 7 pulses here. So now between my cursors is 720, and the issue that we had before seeing that high-low signal, the reason we were seeing those lows is I was actually picking up this interference right here. You can see it right here too. But since I adjusted my scales and moved the plug wires away, we can see that this is my number 1 right here. Well, we're not really sure because there's no compression on that cylinder. And its companion, which would be this one, number 4, also has no compression. And the reason we're not seeing the high-low pattern is because of that. We need compression in these cylinders to see that event, and so my firing lines are the same each time, and I really can't tell you where number 1 is and where number 4 is as far as TDC compression. I know where they are top dead center, but I don't know if it's top dead center compression or exhaust. Not really important for this. The important part is we are missing a hump right here, we're missing a hump right here. We have low compression in 2 of the cylinders, and we're missing a cam signal. And so what this is looking like, back up for a second, think about where we started. MAP sensor was showing positive voltage increases during a crank, suggesting we're getting pressure into the intake from somewhere else. And I said either a plugged exhaust or a broken chain. So we got an exhaust valve that's staying closed and an intake valve that's stuck open, and each time the piston comes up, we're pumping that pressure up into the manifold, and what that suggests is a broken chain. The other thing that we're going after a broken chain for is I have no cam signal. The cam signal is driven off the camshaft itself, and I believe based on this signal we have no movement there. Now we could of course have other issues with this cam sensor. It could be wiring, you know, power in the ground and that, but based on what we are seeing, I'm not even going to bother checking that next. I'm going to pull the sensor out and take a look at the camshaft and see if it's turning. Now if this was an engine with an oil cap that the rocker arms were exposed, if you take the oil cap off, look at the rocker arms, we could do that. Unfortunately I can't do that on this engine. There's really no quicker way for me to identify no cam movement than to pull the sensor out and take a look visually at that cam and see if it's turning. So that's going to be the next thing. I'm saying that this engine has a broken camshaft. Sorry, not a broken camshaft, a broken chain. It could be the cam gear is sheared off, there's no teeth left. And I think before I forget to mention it for later, I think it's interesting that our ignition timing and relative compression are really on here, that we didn't have an issue. If this is what's left of that compression waveform, you're very, very near the top of that hump. And so again, this shows you the limitations of this compression ignition timing test, that if you have a cam sensor or a crank sensor only that drives the ignition system, and that crankshaft sensor never separates from the crank, it doesn't matter if your chain's off or not, your ignition timing is going to be right on for where that piston position is. So again, variable for this test, good one to see. Let's do a visual on this cam next. Okay, I've got the cam sensor out. We're looking at the little lobe right there that drives the sensor. Go ahead and crank it. Okay, good. There is no movement of that camshaft, so that confirms our call that this thing has a broken chain or a busted gear. We're not sure exactly without taking it apart. Okay, some final comments on this video. We have a broken timing belt or a gear or some problem like that. No question about that. That is confirmed. This front cover assembly and everything has to come apart, figure out what's going on with that. Another thought on this truck is, remember we had this EEPROM code, and I'm not addressing that right now, just wanted to stay with this broken timing chain diagnosis. But notice in the picture here, I have the WPS 500 pressure transducer in the cylinder. And what I want to do is make a part 2 of this video. Part 2, we'll do cylinder pressure transducer testing, talk about, again, how we can have compression with a broken chain, and how also we can have ignition timing still be lined up. And so I want you guys to know this, because I'm teaching those methods, and there are variables that are involved here, and it just seems like there's variables on everything. Not seems like, there is. Every new test you learn, chalk it up to memory. That's great, that's a good test, but you know, as you continue and you use them more and more, you find variables to them. And I think that goes with everything we do in this field. So variables upon variables. Look for part 2 coming up next.